Will Great British Railways transform the rail network for the better, or will those ambitions be thwarted by the Treasury? I really want to believe that GBR will be a force for good, and there's every reason to believe there will be benefits to bringing the tracks and trains together. Although I believe any monetary savings claimed by Labour and the unions has been somewhat oversold. Before we dive into the benefits and any concerns, let's quickly look at what GBR will be. In essence, the aim is to establish an arm's-length body that will oversee the running of rail services and the maintenance and upgrades of the railway. So, the current train operating companies, or TOCs, including the ones which are currently directly controlled by the government, will be amalgamated into GBR. There will likely be some regional control and separation of services, but hopefully a lot of the duplication of roles at the top of each of the current TOCs will be done away with, which is theoretically where some of the savings will come from. This should mean that services are managed by regional managers, rather than each TOC having its own managing director, which is still the case with the publicly run TOCs such as TPE and Northern Rail. It's likely there will be some further regional separation, with the likes of Merseyrail and the B network having their own management, which reports to the city region mayors rather than to GBR directly. Merseyrail is for the time being still managed by a private company, but only the day-to-day services, and wider decisions about spending are ultimately made by the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority. I think it's important to add at this point that the few remaining TOCs, which are operated by private companies, are done so under management contract agreements, with companies paid what could be considered a nominal fee to operate services. They do not receive farebox revenue nor take any profits from those fares. This has mostly been the case since the pandemic, the only exception being open access operators, who operate services at their own risk and pay track access charges to Network Rail, with any surplus they make taken as profit. As for the tracks, it's likely that the Network Rail name will be dropped altogether, and the company, which is already wholly owned by the government, will be fully integrated into GBR. The infrastructure is already owned by the state, so the use of the word nationalisation to describe the establishment of GBR is perhaps somewhat of a misnomer. The only part of the railway which is being nationalised are the few remaining services managed by private companies. In my opinion, the word nationalisation has been overused and to some extent oversold. However, that's not to say GBR will fail to deliver any benefits. Removing duplicated management roles will provide savings, and the new regional managers should be able to work more closely with each other and the subdivision that will be responsible for the infrastructure. Streamlining the management and bringing tracks and trains together should theoretically provide savings, as long as GBR does not become a bloated and inefficient organisation, which is always a risk with large publicly operated departments. Well, let's say, for argument's sake, this does provide efficiency savings. It won't be in the billions of pounds range, and will more likely be tens of millions of pounds of savings. To put this in context, if £100 million was saved, this would only buy around 12 4-car trains. So we shouldn't expect a dramatic reduction in rail fares or increase in investment. The only way we will see a meaningful reduction in fare prices is if passenger figures increase markedly or the government agrees to provide more subsidy. The railways cost around £26 billion a year to operate, which includes operational costs, maintenance and renewals, but doesn't include enhancements or reopening railways. £14 billion of that is covered by rail fares and other income, while the government provides around £12 billion in subsidy, which equates to around 45%. There has been a concerted effort by previous governments dating back before the Conservatives got into power to keep subsidy below 50%. So it seems unlikely that the current or future government will commit to increasing subsidy in order to reduce fares. Therefore, any reduction will have to be funded through substantial operational savings and/or a significant increase in ridership. The latter will, however, be difficult to accommodate without further investment. As anyone who travels by train regularly knows, many services are already extremely busy. And with services still tailored to peak commuter traffic, it can often seem that midday and weekend services are full and standing, whereas expensive peak services can be much quieter. Perhaps once services are fully integrated, this is something GBR can address. So now we know what GBR is, it's time to talk about what GBR won't be. It won't be British Rail, and it won't own trains, for the most part. Personally, I don't think we should be looking back to the old BR days with rose-tinted glasses, and instead we should be looking forward and be mindful not to repeat the mistakes of the past. As for the trains, they will still mostly be owned by rolling stock companies, or ROSCOs, with a few exceptions, such as Merseyrail, as the LCRCA purchased the trains outright. The majority of trains will, however, still be owned by ROSCOs. Owning trains is arguably much more profitable than operating services, and a small number of large investment funds own the trains, which are then leased to the TOCs, and eventually GBR. There are no plans currently to change this arrangement, mostly because, as well as making large profits from leasing the trains, the owners also have large debts, which are used to purchase the trains. So, GBR would first have to establish a train operating company and then settle the debts of the ROSCOs, which could amount to tens of billions of pounds. The train maintenance depots are also mostly operated by private companies. Therefore, further costly negotiations would be needed to bring them into GBR. So, for now, trains will remain privately owned. Whether the government chooses to procure trains directly in future is another question. Now, I do have plenty of concerns about GBR, possibly too many to fit into this video. But the biggest concern, in my opinion, is whether or not the Treasury will allow GBR to invest heavily in the network, or if it sees this as a way simply to cut costs. One line contained within the GBR update did give me particular cause for concern. The funding available for GBR will be determined primarily by the Transport Secretary as part of the overall funding arrangements for transport that are agreed by His Majesty's Treasury. This means the Treasury will still have overall oversight when it comes to investment, which is to be expected of course. But the view from the Treasury seems to be that rail upgrades don't provide sufficient returns, which is most likely why the government's investment strategy seemed so underwhelming, and long-promised rail schemes outside of London have either been cancelled, curtailed, or postponed by so much that they've effectively been cancelled. See the recent announcement about the promised new tram network for Leeds. One last concern I have is regarding control, and the person who has ultimate say other than the Treasury. The update states, the Secretary of State for Transport will be the sole shareholder and primary funder of GBR, and will be democratically accountable to Parliament for its performance. This means the Secretary of State will have final say when it comes to improvements and any major decisions, which could be a concern, as GBR may bring tracks and trains together, but ScotRail, Transport for Wales, Merseyrail and the B network will be separate entities, and regional politicians will have their own ideas about how trains should be run locally. There are also freight companies and open access operators to consider, which means conflicts will arise. So the question then becomes, should a Westminster-based Secretary of State have the ultimate say over local service provision, or should an arm's length department, similar to the Office of Rail and Road, be able to challenge decisions and hold the Transport Minister or GBR managers to account if it's felt they acted unfairly? I know there has been a lot of coverage recently about poor decision making by the ORR, but I still believe some oversight over GBR will be required. That's not to say I don't support the principle of GBR, but there are still quite a few unanswered questions that, if left unanswered, will be concerning. And I haven't even touched on the new livery or the app yet, so I will likely release another video on the subject soon. Before I go, I'd like to say a big thank you to my Patreon and YouTube members who support the channel. Your ongoing support really is appreciated, so thank you. If you'd like to consider supporting the channel, there'll be links in the description below.